the irony of all of this is that it actually makes regime change very, very difficult in Ukraine. It makes regime change very, very difficult in Ukraine because Zelensky has effectively neutered all opposition, not just in terms of the pro-Russian elements within Ukraine, but also you can say among those who would actually want to continue the war in perpetuity. You can even say, to a further extent, with a greater ferocity than that of Zelensky himself. The whole premise of the Ukrainian state now under Zelensky is that of the war state. The whole security state is perpetuated by this conflict. If Zelensky has to make peace, he then has to justify holding elections, elections which he fears he will lose. Thus, he has to basically hold his legitimacy together through presentation of selected polls rather than going through a national polling system, i.e., through a national election. And that's essentially what the Russians want. And if the Americans want it too, I believe it'll be fundamentally destabilizing to Ukraine because so much of the Ukrainian system is personally loyal to Zelensky as a result of the creation of Zelensky's war state. So I believe that any peace in the remnant of Ukraine will inevitably involve a destabilization of Ukraine. And that, of course, is what Russia wants. But let's get into really what Russia wants. If Russia wants destabilization, it wants weakness. It wants Ukraine to be a weak and supplicant state, and I think that's obvious. What does Russia really mean when it doesn't want Ukraine to join NATO? Well, this is neutrality by compulsion. What does it mean where Russia wants to denazify Ukrainian politics? It wants to have a pervading influence over what political parties and actors are allowed to operate within Ukraine. In other words, neutrality by compulsion is not neutrality at all. Denazification is on itself a mission to deprive Ukraine of its sovereignty. In the same way that Ukraine sundering these elements, you can say, of its more Russified patrimony, attacking political opponents, suppressing the church, is again another element by which you can say democracy, such as it exists in Ukraine, is a farce. Instead, we have Ivan Mazepa in the form of Zelensky trying to carve out his kingdom and turning what ultimately should be a federal structure into Ukraine into a unitary monarchical state, a monarchical state which is held up with the support of Carolus Rex in the West until we have the example of Poltava. You can even say perhaps that the recent disaster in Kursk could be the equivalent of Zelensky's own Poltava, if we're going to look at Ivan Mazepa. So on the one hand, you can say you have the delusions of sovereignty being supported by NATO membership in the West, but you also have that similar delusion being pursued by the Russian policy of denazification in the East. Indeed, both visions are terrifying for Ukraine. One vision from the West is using Ukraine as a meat shield to force more and more and more conscripts to essentially be killed on the trenches against Russia. And then you have the Russian vision, which is of a weak, pliant, destabilized Ukraine, which is effectively demilitarized. What is neutrality? Neutrality ought to be a natural expression of self-determination. Neutrality is a statement that I am not going to be compelled into a system of alliances. You can say that there are many nations that attempted to pursue this policy of neutrality during the interwar period. You can say, for example, the state of Denmark, Sweden. You can say one of the great successes of Sweden during that time is that it was able to effectively assert some form of net neutrality, which actually meant deference towards Germany in terms of its economics and its trading relationship by necessity. But if we look to the example of Belgium, what is neutrality really when we talk about greater powers surrounding a smaller power, i.e. NATO on the one hand and Russia on the other? Neutrality is a byproduct of compulsion and military strength. What was the scrap of paper? What was the Treaty of London which held neutrality in Belgium together? It was the agreement of France and of Germany, Prussia, and of Great Britain not to invade that country. In other words, if one nation feels it's stronger than the others, it can basically violate that neutrality and make that neutrality a nonsense, which is what the Germans felt that they could effectively achieve when they invaded Belgium in 1914. So in other words, The whole notion of neutrality in Ukraine, should the Russians be able to achieve it, i.e., eternal non-membership of NATO, can only be sustained by the constant preparation of a future conflict with NATO. That is inevitable. If ever Russia is seen to be weak, like it was in the 1990s, then neutrality all of a sudden becomes a nonsense. This is neutrality which is enforced at the point of a sword. Russia must effectively have a force ready to invade Ukraine, as we see with the special military operation, at any time, should it feel that Ukraine is being pulled over into the Western camp once again. In other words, like I said, this is a recipe not for a lasting peace settlement. This is a recipe for perpetual conflict. But now let's look at the logic of Russian expansionism. Already that we have seen Crimea has been taken over by Russia and they have annexed the 4 oblasts, even though they have failed to remove Ukrainian troops from those territories. Assuming they do, the logic of Russian expansionism really shouldn't stop at the 4 oblasts. So we're looking at this from a geostrategic point of view. You have the Russian enclave next to Moldova in the Transnistria. Indeed, Russia has a lot of influences regarding Moldova and a lot of historical ties there. You can say the only reason Moldova exists as a country is because Russia tore it away from Romania. If Moldova were to become fully integrated into the West, it should by extension become fully integrated into Romania, which perhaps they can do now. Călinescu has been barred from election in Romania. Perhaps that's the next step. But somehow I doubt it's going to come out like that. But nevertheless, it'll be an interesting example of defying Russia's historical legacy by reincorporating Moldova back into Romania. But someone is mentioning in the chat about the natural boundary of the Dnieper. No, Russia needs to go further than that. Russia would need to annex Bessarabia. Russia would need to annex Odessa. Both of these elements have a huge amount of historical, ethnic, and strategic implications for Russia. We're going to integrate these territories. Indeed, so long as Ukraine holds Odessa, Ukraine will always be a threat to Russia's dominance over the Black Sea, especially if we see there's going to be a process, you can say, of arming up Romania and establishing a NATO Black Sea presence in Romania as well, in addition to the Black Sea coast that we already see with Turkey. In other words, Russia really shouldn't stop at the 4 oblasts. So we're talking about maximalism. You know, so many Western commentators talk about Putin's maximalist demands. No, the maximalist demands are to take Odessa and to establish Russian boundaries, taking over places like Kharkov and in other areas, expanding Russian influence to that of the Dnieper River as one boundary, but also taking over all of Ukraine's military bases, naval bases in the Black Sea would be another element to it. But that again, like I said, the smaller Ukraine becomes, the more Western it becomes, the more vitriolic and completely opposed to Russia the remnant Ukraine becomes, because the Russophilic aspects of Ukraine, the Russian patrimony of Ukraine, are taken away. And what is left effectively are those elements of Ukrainian society, and indeed areas that have only recently been part of a Soviet patrimony, like Galicia or the Rusian Carpathian region. All of these elements are effectively to say that what is left then of Ukraine becomes ever more hostile to Russia, which would mean the imposition of neutrality on that territory becomes ever more difficult. So what then is the logic that would extend from there? Well, further expansion is not enough to take the 4 oblasts, is not enough to take Odessa, is not enough to take Bessarabia, is not enough to take the eastern Dnieper region, but you need to keep expanding. And ironically, the further you expand into, say, for example, Poland's sphere of influence in the case of Galicia, then the whole logic of the special military operation appears in reverse. In the same way that Ukraine becoming a part of NATO was seen as an existential threat to Russia, why shouldn't the European Union and NATO see Russian troops in Lviv or Lvov as an existential threat to Europe? Indeed, you can see a bizarre situation that as Russia keeps expanding into Ukraine, that NATO will end up invading Ukraine on its own volition. What then effectively becomes the future of Ukraine? If we see that Zelensky's war state will not collapse in and of itself, The whole basis of Zelensky's war state is based on the perpetuation of said conflict, because if Zelensky were to end the conflict, the whole regime could inevitably collapse, which would lead to destabilization, which will further lead to continued conflict. Well, assuming that we have two blows, effectively a partition like we saw during the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, except done with no no sort of amicable settlement. This is very much done by both sides acting in an act of supreme hostility towards one another, attempting to prevent them carving out spheres of influence. Poland annexing Galicia and the areas of Ukraine that were formerly part of the East Polish patrimony, or the Kresy, during the Second Polish Republic, which ended in 1939 with the partition of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And then you have the rest, which is occupied or basically a vassal for Russia. Then effectively all you have is the North Korean scenario. You have two hostile states facing off against each other, and perhaps a demilitarized zone, perhaps at Kiev, or perhaps a little bit to the west of Kiev, separating these territories. The reason, again, I bring this up is that very few people I've seen commenting are really going at length to explain the logistics of what neutrality, non-membership of NATO really entails. The fact that Russian demands of non-NATO membership become more unreasonable the more truncated Ukraine becomes, the less territory effectively is able to operate effective control over, because by extension, Ukraine then becomes more fanatical in its opposition to Russia. And again, I go back to the tragedy. I go back to the fantasy I brought up at the beginning of the ideal post-Soviet settlement for Ukraine, that of it really emblemizing, going with the idea of the borderlands, the federal structure, bringing the best of Russian civilization and European civilization together, bringing all of these cultural and religious connections, which again make Ukraine, like I said, one of the most heterogeneous states, historically heterogeneous states. I don't mean that in the sense of diversity is our strength. Please disabuse yourselves of any notion if I'm trying to make some sort of equivocacy here. But I mean heterogeneous in the sense that these territories were historically divided between great empires, warring empires. Hence, Ukraine is therefore an incredibly apt etymology for this state, the borderlands between these two empires. But what I think Russia views the history of Ukraine as is a version of the Morgenthau Plan. Destabilized and effectively deindustrialized, demilitarized, whereas the Western view of Ukraine is highly militarized, the icebreaker on Russia's border. If it can sunder Ukrainian nationality away from Russia, it can be used as the breach point, the bridgehead from which Russia could be dismembered as a nation. Because ironically, Putin is earnestly appealing to a Soviet-era mantra, a Tsarist-era mantra of the integration of Russia's peoples. It is not a Russian nation state in the sense that it is an ethno-state. It is why, say, for example, when I brought up the example of Croatia earlier and Slobodan Milosevic, that is imperfect, and why I believe that Putin has only very blatantly resorted to what you can say a revanchist, irredentist political strategy of reattaching Russian speakers into Russia proper, is because Putin is not an ethno-nationalist. He believes that having a distinct policy based on the reincorporation of Russian people back into Russia lends itself to this idea that Russia is an ethno-state. Indeed, the more Russians see themselves as distinct from all other peoples within the Russian Federation, that in itself destabilizes the Russian Federation, because the Russian Federation is a hodgepodge of vast national groups, from the Tatars to the Kalmucks, to the Siberian peoples, etc., to the Karelians, to the Ugric peoples, etc., 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 to the Chechens. The list goes on and on and on. So, from my point of view, considering all of these elements, I don't believe that peace in Ukraine is possible. That's not to say that there may be some ceasefire at some point, but any settlement that could be achieved by the Trump administration, I believe, will be fleeting, in the same way that we saw the original Minsk agreements were fleeting. The Europeans were clearly using them to buy time. Do you honestly believe, if there was a concession made for the neutrality of Ukraine, that the United States won't try and do this again? Europe has predicated essentially its existence in terms of a defense state, the ever sort of furthering integration of Europe based on the fates of Ukraine. For Europe, Ukraine is an imperial project. Ukraine was supposed to be the great breadbasket of Europe. You can almost see reviving the idea of the Reichskommissariat Ukraine, back during World War II. All of these elements that again suggest that the element of completely hostile strategy directed against Russia has not gone away. And it won't go away.